All right, for those of you joining us on the recorded session, welcome to Week 9 U.S. History Seminar, our only one this week since Tuesday was ACT Day. So, there we go. This week in announcement land, you should be working on the second half of the Unit 3 reading guide. It is due on Friday, that is tomorrow. You do have the grace period through the 31st. Again, I caution not to wait till the grace period to turn it in. Don't treat that as your due date. That's just going to hurt you. That's when your internet's going to go down. That's when Google Drive is going to crap out on you. Any number of things. I keep getting these frantic emails. Oh, I didn't know I had to work tonight. Blah, blah, blah. So don't do that to yourself. If you treat Friday as the due date and you turn it in Saturday, you're okay. If you treat the 31st as the due date and you miss it, wah, wah. Test will go live next week. I will leave that up during spring break. Since our spring break is wonky, it's not a calendar week. I think what I'm going to do is basically just treat those 2 half weeks as a week of class stuff, for lack of a better term. So everything will be up during those 2 weeks as though it's a week. That way folks that are leaving town or whatever won't have as much to catch up on, hopefully. Yeah, so that's what's happening next week. Test will go live next Monday. Don't forget to do the discussion forum. People are skipping those, and that's not good. Don't forget to do the seminar assignments, Week 9 CNN 10 News Quiz, and Week 9 Seminar Journal. And last but not least, please join the Remind. I shouldn't have to keep begging, but yeah. Hang on 1 second. I have a visitor in my room that I need to talk. All right, and we're back. All right, so we're talking post-World War II economic boom today. The period after World War II that actually lasts until roughly 1973, when, especially in the United States, you have this massive economic surge. We're going to be particularly talking about the early part of this, like the 1950s, but we'll keep revisiting this topic as we go through the rest of this semester. So why does this occur, especially in the United States, although the effects of this are actually felt globally to a large extent? The big thing with the places like the US and also places like Sweden is that there was not a lot of actual fighting in the United States. Same with Sweden. Sweden did not see any actual fighting. So, with the exception of, for the US, like Pearl Harbor and some of our territories overseas, there was not a lot of rebuilding that had to happen to bring factories back online and things like that. In fact, the United States was largely supplying both Britain and the Soviet Union and later on France with war materials. Oh, and China, don't forget China, with war materials so that they could also continue fighting the Axis powers. So the U.S. was already humming in terms of production when, just a few months after the war started, things were really kicking into gear, at least when the U.S. joined the war. So then combine that with some other factors. The U.S. is going to pour millions, actually billions, into rebuilding specifically Western Europe and Japan as well as building up American infrastructure. Uh, we will also see a period of tremendous government spending, but also taxes that match that level of government spending. Yes, it will still not keep pace necessarily with what the government is spending. So the deficit will increase, but it's not really until the 1970s, 1980s that the deficit that we think of really explodes. And that's after we cut those relatively high tax rates. You have the manufacturing sector of the U.S. economy growing all the time during this time period. And then near the end of that, it's starting to decline, and that does not help things. And then finally, the U.S. is going to take care of people that fought the war. All right, so let's delve into those a little bit. So one of the big things that is going to help not only the United States, but also globally, is that the U.S. is going to take the lead in rebuilding the nations that it helped to largely destroy in the course of the war. So this includes nations of Western Europe as well as Japan. And the U.S. is going to spend, at the time, roughly $13.3 billion. In modern money, we're talking over $100 billion to rebuild Britain, France, basically Western Europe as we know it. Now, this was not just a completely selfless act on the US's part. This was not just, oh, we love you and we're going to help you. This was largely the United States sort of buying, if not love, loyalty. The US actually offered this money. The Marshall Plan was the plan to rebuild Europe. They offered this to all of the nations impacted by World War II in Europe. The nations in the central and eastern part of Europe that were under the sway of the Soviet Union were basically told that they were not allowed to accept any of this money. Czechoslovakia tried, and their leader was called to Moscow and basically told in no uncertain terms that if they accepted Marshall Plan aid, they would be invaded by the Soviet Union and they would basically kill that person. So the nations of Central and Eastern Europe had the Soviets had their own rebuilding plan. It was called the Molotov Plan. But if you visit Western Europe and then you visit places in Eastern Europe and you look at things built during those times, you can see that very, very different. The things that were built using Marshall Plan money are actually moderately attractive. The things that were built under the Molotov Plan and under the Soviet system are ugly as sin. Very utilitarian, very, just frankly, ugly big buildings. So yeah, $100 billion worth of rebuilding in Europe. And that's going to help lead to places like Britain and West Germany and places like that having huge economic booms after the war is over, because they're not having to outlay as much money to rebuild their own country. The United States is handling that. And so they're able to focus on economic development. The same can be said for Japan. The U.S. spent $2.2 billion at the time, which is roughly $18 billion adjusted for modern inflation, to rebuild the country of Japan. The United States occupied Japan, and whereas in Europe, the U.S. had to sort of cooperate with the Soviet Union, largely the rebuilding of Japan and the occupation of Japan was an American-only operation. There was no division of Tokyo into different zones like you had in Germany. This was purely an American operation with sort of support from the British, but very limited support from the British. But again, the same sort of thing occurred. Japan was able to focus its its personal recovery on building up its economy instead of trying to rebuild roads and bridges and things like that. And consequently, Japan becomes an economic powerhouse after the war. Also, in Japan, they wrote into their constitution that they cannot have a military. And the US agreed to provide Japan with a national defense. And that agreement still holds to this day. So Japan does not spend hardly any of its gross domestic product on defense. They have a small self-defense force, but if anything major happens, the United States is under treaty to defend Japan against any kind of attack. So if China, for example, decided it wanted to make trouble and try and invade Japan, the United States would be at war with China in that case. Yeah, it helps when somebody else is picking up the big ticket items like a national defense. But again, this is America buying loyalty. They did not want Japan to fall into the possibility of becoming a communist country. And that was the same in Europe. They didn't want Britain and France and all these other countries to go communist. So they are going to make it so that the US is going to help rebuild these countries. The US is also going to have very high tax rates, specifically on the wealthiest Americans. These high marginal tax rates are going to do things like help build an interstate highway system. The highway system in the United States before the 1950s was an absolute joke. It took over a month to cross the country because there was no federal system of highways. There was, like Route 66 was, you could go from Chicago to California on Route 66, but it was not particularly efficient. And if you've ever seen the movie Cars, you sort of understand why. Because as you're driving through this, you're driving through these little towns, and so if you're hauling widgets, you're hauling goods from Chicago to LA, you have to slow down when you get to every town. Whereas on the interstate highway system that will start being built in the mid 1950s, you don't have to slow down really that much as you pass by towns. It might nowadays, I think, as you drive past big cities, you have to slow down to like 65 on interstate highways, down from 75 or 80. When you're driving past major cities. That's nothing. That's barely a blip. Whereas driving through these little towns, now that did have an effect on those little towns. And again, watch the movie Cars and you will understand the kind of impact that had on places like in the movie Radiator Springs. So you also had a situation where the US never really dropped its war production. So the US, there will be companies that will move in to take over making war goods. We basically have a permanent war economy in the United States because starting with World War II, we are not going to really reduce the size of our military force all that much. Some of those people that fought in World War II are going to go home and they're never going to fight again. But you're also going to have new people joining the military. And to this day, the US military is a large fighting force, not compared to some places, but overall, the US military is quite large. So you need war goods to outfit those soldiers. You need to constantly be refreshing your tanks and your planes and now your missiles and things like that. So you have basically constant war production. But while that's happening, you also have those companies that were tasked with making war goods that now in peacetime get to go back to making cars and toasters and what they were making before. So you have high levels of production that are going to be combined with this new, basically, war economy. You have huge amounts of, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, school construction, municipal building projects, subways, transportation systems. Again, the interstate highway system is going to be built during this time, which was a huge outlay of federal money. It was inspired by the German Autobahn. It was one of the things that Eisenhower was really impressed with as he went into Germany, as the US was occupying Germany. He saw this massive highway system that Germany had that enabled the German the German government to get goods from one place to another very, very quickly. And it was also a public defense thing. They could evacuate cities very, very quickly. And that's part of the interstate highway system to this day, is it runs past major cities, and so let's say there's a threat of a nuclear bomb being dropped. They can make both sides of the freeways one way and empty cities very, very quickly. In some places, those freeways are wide enough to land and take off planes. They are as much public safety and military tools as they are transportation tools. And so this actually plays into the work of a British economist named John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes changed the way that countries thought about how governments should be affiliated with the economy. When we were talking about the 1920s, we talked about the laissez-faire system and how the government was basically very hands-off with the economy. The market was going to do what the market was going to do, and the government didn't meddle. Keynes says, no, the government should be meddling. The government should be, spending money on these big projects, because that's going to employ people. Those people are going to have money in their pocket. Those people are going to spend that money. That money is going to go to buy things. The businesses that sell those things are going to be able to increase production. They're going to be able to employ more people. And that's going to lead to fewer people having to work for the government and more people working in the private sector. And that's going to help basically save capitalism. And that's ultimately kind of what happens. We call this pump priming, or priming the pump. Basically, the government spending money to give people jobs so that they have money to spend, so that private businesses can then have money and increase production and all of those things. And this is largely okay, even though, yeah, the deficit's going to increase and the national debt's going to increase a bit. But during this time, and it might be a little difficult to see because those numbers are really tiny down at the bottom, the tax rates in the United States are going to be a lot higher on actually everyone, but in particular on the wealthiest people. That blue line is the top marginal tax rate, so the people that make the most money in the country. So basically, how marginal tax rates work is that everybody pays the same amount of taxes on their initial 0 to, let's say, $20,000. That's not the number, but let's just use that as an example. And then if you make more than $20,000, between, let's say, $20,000 and $40,000, you pay an additional tax just on that 20 to 40. And you pay another tax if you make $60,000, 40 to 60, etc. Okay, so the top marginal tax rate, the people that are in that top tax bracket, if you look in the 1950s, they're paying 90% of that top income in taxes, not on the entire income, on that top marginal income. But then you notice that starting in the late 60s, that gets cut. And in the 70s and starting in the 1980s, it's cut again and again and again. Okay? So when the economy of the United States was truly booming, our marginal tax rates, our top tax rate was right around 90%. That's huge and very different than our tax rates today. People say, oh, we pay so much in taxes. Not comparatively. Not really. And you'll notice too that from 1940 1947 or so to this goes to 2007, you see that you go from a situation where the gap between the richest people and the poorest people in the country is narrower to, in 2007, it's quite wide. And again, that has to do with, at least in part, those tax rates going down for the wealthiest people. Also notice that the poorest group has not gotten any sort of substantial raise in, the better part of 50, 60 years. So you also have increases in production, both manufacturing and agriculture. In agricultural terms, you see after the war things like chemical fertilizers, tractors, combine harvesters, high yield varieties of crops. So you start to see genetically engineered crops that basically produce more crop. You also see increased use of pesticides, some of those for good, some of those for not so good. Some of them were determined to cause cancer. Manufacturing expanded again to make war goods as well as consumer goods. This was aided by automation. These factories were not just powered by people, they were powered by machines. Retail expands during this time as transportation improves and businesses can truck things between long distances. The ability for people to buy things at retail stores, you can buy more stuff at retail stores. That's huge. Also helps that the price of oil was quite low. And the graph on your screen there shows the real price of oil versus not adjusted for inflation. And so the real price is in 2015 dollars. Notice that from the 1930s through about the early 1970s, it really is, it's under $20 a barrel, or right around $20 a barrel, and then gets out of control. So a lot of these, the interstate highway system was built using gas-powered machinery. That was much cheaper to do back then when oil was not as expensive. And then finally, veterans. So remember this? This was a picture of the bonus marchers clashing with the DC police, demanding payment of a bonus from World War I because the soldiers in World War I made, to use a technical economist term, diddly squat. Well, during World War II, the government decided we don't want this to happen again. Good gravy. We need to take care of the people that fought for us. And so you have the introduction of a thing called the GI Bill that is still around today. Now, the initial one expired in about 1956, but has been reauthorized. And so today's GI Bill looks a little different, but it's the same general idea. The original piece of legislation was called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. This included access to, for people who served, up to 90 days, or as few as 90 days active duty, and that had not been dishonorably discharged, you had access to things like a low-cost mortgage. So basically a guaranteed mortgage at a low interest rate. This enabled people to buy houses. This is becoming a major problem in the United States today. Housing prices have skyrocketed. People in, your generation and, slightly older are not able to buy houses as easily because they simply cost too much money. So low-cost mortgages, low-interest business and farm loans. You want to start a business? You want to start a farm? You want to buy a farm and be a farmer? You can use your GI Bill to help you buy a farm, to help you buy a business. They had a 1-year unemployment compensation program for people that were just getting out of the military. If you had trouble finding a job, you had basically a guaranteed income for a year. Now, we're talking $20 a week, which back then was actually decent money. But it was called the 5220 Club, 52 weeks, $20 a week. You could use this for tuition and living expenses to attend school, whether that was getting your high school diploma, which was not, a guaranteed thing back then, or to get college training or postgraduate training, or simply job training if you were going to become a welder or something like that and go through an apprenticeship program. This could be used to pay for those living expenses and those training expenses. So all of those things were rolled into this GI Bill. This is Franklin Roosevelt signing that GI Bill. Now, this was largely more beneficial for white veterans than it was for African American veterans in the early going and other minorities. This accounted for Jim Crow laws and things like that, and the states got to administer big chunks of this, and so minorities kind of, as is par for the course in American history, got the fuzzy end of that lollipop. But overall, the benefit of this was huge. And just some posters. The two that are actual posters show that you could use this for educational training. You could use this to buy a home, a business, or a farm. And then at the bottom is a cartoon that the government put out with all of the options that these veterans had. So again, they were going to have a leg up versus the veterans of World War I that came back, and those that had gotten to stay behind had gotten economically much further ahead than the people that had actually fought in World War I. So this was huge. And so you see things like, this is an aerial photo of a town in New Jersey called Levittown, which was this big housing project in Levittown was in New Jersey, excuse me. They had some of these in Pennsylvania too. So basically this building company went in and built all of these little houses, basically identical, more or less. And these veterans could buy these houses darn cheap. And these were suburbs, and their kids could be raised in these little largely white communities. But this was huge. And a lot of what you see when you look at things from the 1950s, even shows about the 1950s, like if you watched WandaVision, the early part of that was very much suburban existence in the 1950s. The housewife cooking the dinner, and all of that was definitely an homage to the 1950s. So this was all made possible basically thanks to the GI Bill and thanks to massive amounts of government spending. So there we go. That is the post-war boom in a nutshell. So your journal topic: why did the American economy boom after World War II? What, if any, lessons do you think America could draw from this time and apply to our current times? And why do you think that? If I don't get all the reading gid done by Friday or Wednesday, can I just turn in what I get done on Wednesday? Yeah, I mean, I go through them, and I routinely knock off points when people have turned things in incomplete. So it's not just a 0. Whatever you turn in, I do grade, and I assign points accordingly. All right, so make sure to write your response to this journal topic in the journal assignment. Remember, that's worth 15 points. Don't skip it. Are there any questions about anything that we talked about today? Oh. Okay, so if there are no questions, you can be free. If you have something you need to talk to me about, hang out and we will discuss it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will keep sharing the screen. I'm just turning off the recording.